All right, we'll give it one more minute. Now, I know Pastor Ken is really good at this, so, his bar is way up here. So don't judge me too harshly compared to him. I'm excited for this Bible study series. I love doing series on women in the Bible. I, having grown up in the Missouri Synod of the Lutheran Church, found studying the women of the Bible and the way that God empowered the women of the Bible to do amazing things really empowering in my own life. And in discerning a call to ministry, my senior year of college, one of the things that I did in preparation for my comprehensive exams was I did a paper on women in ministry. And so I focused that paper more on the work of the women in the early church and Paul's mention of the women who ran the house churches as deacons and leaders of the church. But to have the stories of our female ancestors in the faith is really helpful for us as women and for men who study, because God calls all of us. And as we heard on Sunday, Jesus refers to himself as a mother hen, and we do have female imagery here and there. It's not as predominant as the male imagery for God. And getting to see how all of us are included in the ministries that God calls us to is a really helpful thing. So I am grateful that you are here, grateful that you are tuning in on YouTube. And let's get started with prayer. The Lord be with you. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this day, for the sunshine, for a glimpse of spring with the warm air, for a chance to study your scriptures. Breathe through the scriptures and enliven us in the stories of the women who have come before us, and through your love and grace and call have brought forth a history of leaders in faith. Be with us, bless this time, and bless us in the ways that you call us to serve your people. Amen. Okay. So our first topic in this study is going to be Sarah and Hagar. The difficulty with some of the women in the Old Testament is unwinding their stories from the stories of the men to whom they are connected. Because in those ancient times, and I would argue up until the end of the medieval times, well, even in some ways up until women could have their own bank account, there were legal aspects to being in partnership with a man. And so in the ancient world, these were specifically business contracts. That's what marriage contracts were. And so when we look at the stories of the women in the scriptures, particularly in the Old Testament, we have to do a little bit of teasing out the stories of the women versus the stories of the men that they were married to or partnered with in some way. And so this story begins with the story of Abraham, who in the beginning was Abram. And God tells Abram in chapter 7 of Genesis, or chapter 12 of Genesis, that they're going to leave home and go to a place that God is going to show them later. And they're going to take their nephew Lot and just go. Pick up, leave home. Now, at this point, Abram is 75. His wife Sarah, 65. So imagine God coming to you and saying, hey, I want you to pack up, take your nephew and your partner, and you're going to leave home and go to a place to be named later. Right? Right, exactly. But God promises that he will make of, and I'm going to just use Abraham because all the name swapping gets a little bit tricky. God promises that God will make of Abraham a great nation. And so Abraham takes Sarah and Lot, and they go. But when they get to Canaan, there's a famine. And so they go immediately from Canaan to Egypt. And when they get there, Abraham realizes, ooh, my wife's really pretty. And the Egyptians are going to steal her from me and kill her, or kill me, so that they can take her. So choosing to value his life over his wife, says, she's my sister. And the Pharaoh says, oh, this woman is gorgeous. I'm going to marry her. And that didn't go so well for Pharaoh. Pharaoh got hit with plagues and sickness all through his house and goes right back to Abraham and says, what is going on? This is a mess. And Abraham says, well, maybe it's because she's actually my wife. And Pharaoh's like, all right, you go. You get out of here. But I'm going to give you all the stuff that I gave you when I married her. So Abraham leaves the situation in a better financial place than he was when they arrived. I don't know why Pharaoh gave him all the stuff, but, he did. Yeah, it's false. Yeah, he got it under false pretenses. That's right. Yeah. Nope, couldn't keep the dowry, so just get out of here, right? Just go. Don't bug me anymore. I don't think Sarah thought very highly of that. I wouldn't. So we move on to chapter 15, which is actually the Old Testament text that we heard on Sunday, that you read for us. So God had promised Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. And it hasn't happened yet. And 75 isn't young. And yeah. Yeah, absolutely 15 to 20 years. No. Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. If you're living that long, it's nothing. But actually, now that I'm in my 40s, 65 is young. The older we get, the more it changes. So Abraham goes to God and says, hey, here's the thing. You promised me I would be the father of many nations. My wife is barren. We have a problem. How is this going to work? Because Eliezer, the servant in my house, he's currently my heir. And so God says to Abraham, as Rosa read for us on Sunday, go outside and look to the heavens and count the stars if you are able to. So shall your descendants be. And he follows that up with talking and with this covenant with the birds and the carcasses of the other animals and all that stuff we won't really get into because it's kind of gross. But I imagine Sarah is eavesdropping on this conversation because she's getting a little impatient. So she goes to her husband and says, look, I have a slave girl named Hagar. I want you to go lay with her because obviously things between us are not working out in the childbearing department. So this is 10 years after Abraham and Sarah have moved to Canaan. So he's now 85 and she's 75. Right, definitely beyond the childbearing years. If she had been able to bear children in the first place, which it seems like she hadn't been. Which could cause which could put her in a dangerous situation. And I think fertility is part of these two stories, of these two women. Because if you were a woman who was unable to bear children, you could be cast off by your husband. You could be seen as cursed by your community. And the women of that time were very much looked down upon by their community if they were unable to bear children. So it's an unfortunate piece of their understanding of the nature of fertility back then. If you had lots of children, God was blessing you. If you were unable to bear children, what did you do that God had cursed you? So that's part of this dynamic between these two women. Sarah gives Hagar, her servant, to Abraham, now as a second wife, and he lays with her, and she pretty quickly conceives. And we're told in Genesis 16, if you're in the Pew Bible, I think it's on page 12. We'll go to chapter 16, verse 3, and I'm going to read through verse 6. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband as a wife. He went in to Hagar and conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abraham, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her, she being Hagar. So we're already seeing this power struggle between these two women. There are now two wives, so they technically have equal status, even though Hagar had zero say on what was going to happen to her. And she was powerless in this whole situation. So she is given as a wife to someone else's husband, and then he lays with her, probably without her consent, and she conceives. But knowing that she is fertile and Sarah is not, there seems to be a little bit of a ha 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 going on. So this dynamic between these two women is already complicated. And we have the opportunity for sisterhood here. And how does that working out? Not well. In an ideal situation, how do you think that Sarai would be treating Hagar? If Sarai said, "Here, bear a child with Hagar, my servant," you would think Sarah would treat her how when she conceived? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Treat her as a surrogate. Yeah.
And since she wanted her husband to have an offspring, it seems that she would treat Hagar better.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that she's, going to be healthy, safe, not having problems with the baby, and have to treat her well. Although technically, she probably would be a little jealous,
Yeah.
but still would treat her better.
Yeah. So there would naturally there's going to be jealousy here on some level, but as you say, treating her with kindness, respect, make sure she's healthy so that the baby's healthy. That is what we would expect. But what are we seeing here? Mm-hmm. Oh, you think that there was a little bit of tension between the two women before?
That started it, more or less.
Yeah, so Sarah could have started it. What do you think, Sandra?
Okay, what's the normal been in those days?
Oh, okay.
I'm the senior wife.
So yeah, you're saying, so Sarah's saying, I'm the senior wife, you're below me.
Which was a given.
Yeah.
That's what's understood.
Mm-hmm.
With her being a slave and that being a mistress, that's already established that the slave is lower than the mistress.
Mm-hmm.
She knows that.
Yeah.
Sure. Probably was pissed off because of that fact. She couldn't do anything except for what her mistress said.
Right?
She may not have wanted to sleep with Abraham,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah, we
now
don't.
her mistress made her sleep with him. Now she said, "Now look what you did."
Right. So we're starting out with this power dynamic where Sarah's way up here and Hagar is down here. But when Hagar is given to marry Abraham, even though she has no choice in the matter, she actually gets elevated to equal status. She's a second wife status, but she's no longer slave. So there's a liberation piece here. And then when Hagar sees how Sarah is treating her, she takes off. So she further liberates herself. We're going to continue in verse 7, again on page 12, in chapter 16. The angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, see, this is where it stays complicated. Where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am running away from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and shall bear a son, and you shall call him Ishmael. For the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, and with his hand against everyone, and with everyone's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with all his kin. So, actually, we're going to pause there, because that next part is my favorite part. So God says, can I have one of those tissues you grabbed, Miss Jackie? Thank you. So the angel of the Lord finds Hagar and says, everything's going to be okay. Go back to Sarah. This power dynamic is reestablished. Submit to Sarah. But I will multiply your offspring, and you will call your son Ishmael, which means God hears. I do wonder what Hagar felt in that moment, having been mistreated and running off. But we see where she goes in verse 13. So after this, she gives God a name. She named the Lord who spoke to her, you are El Roy. For she said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? Therefore, the well was called Bir Lahai Roy. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. El Roy means the God who sees. And so Hagar is recognizing that the Lord has not only heard her, but has seen her. And then we are told at the end of chapter 16 that Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, who Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. It's a bit of a thing. Yeah, absolutely. So Hagar is the only person in the entirety of the scriptures who gives God a name. And that's a really powerful thing. Because we're talking about a woman, and in this context, we're talking from our modern perspective, we're talking about a woman of color from Egypt who was a slave, who ran away from her mistress, and is found in the desert by the Lord, who hears her cry and sees her for who she is. And she has a conversation and says, "Who am I that I have seen the Lord and lived to tell about it?" I think that's a really powerful story that we have here. And it's in the midst of a really complicated story of her relationship with her mistress and her mistress's husband. And now there's their child involved. The rabbis suggest that Hagar is unfazed by the appearance of the angels of the Lord because she had been around for Abraham's conversations with the Lord. So for her, in the context of her relationship with Abraham and Sarah, this is no big deal. It's just now that God is talking to her. Yeah. God had been talking around her all the time. Absolutely. You are correct. Why do you think the Lord would send Hagar back to Sarah if he knew how Sarah had been treating her? Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. She is carrying that child. Firstborn son, Abraham will be. A wild ass of a man. At odds with everyone, the writer of Genesis says. That would kind of, having two kids myself, that kind of gives me pause. If the Lord had said he will be a wild ass of a man, I'm like, am I sure I want to do this? Kids are kids, man. This is who I made him to be. Don't calm him down. Yeah. That's an interesting take on that. I like it. This is who I made him to be. And, there's difficulty with that because no one wants to hear that your child will live at odds with all his kin. And she's already living in that kind of relationship. She's already at odds with her household. Yeah. We're gonna jump to chapter 18 because this goes back to Sarah. We've had in chapter 17 the sign of the covenant between Abraham. This is where the renaming happens in chapter 17. So Abram is now Abraham and Sarai is now Sarah. And the name change, I think, is important. And here, that's why I put this here, because the names in the Bible indicated who people were. And so there is great importance. So Abram starts out as meaning exalted ancestor, whereas Abraham means the ancestor of a multitude. And Sarai means quarrelsome. They hit the nail on the head with that one. But when she is renamed Sarah, it means princess. So she becomes exalted. And it is in the sign of the covenant here, then in chapter 16, that the sign of the covenant becomes physical. There's a piece that Abraham has to do. And so this is where circumcision comes in as the sign of the covenant. And the poor gentleman has to start out by taking care of himself first before he circumcises his own household. So we're just going to jump over that part. But he's 99 in this moment. He started out 75 and 65. And God said, I will make you the ancestor of many nations. And now they're 99 and 89, still have no child of their own, and now Ishmael and Hagar are in the mix. Yeah. He's 13. So he's exactly a teenager. So if you were Sarah at this point, who's 89, she's been waiting 24 years. She's got a teenage stepson. And yet, God's promise that she would bear a child hasn't happened yet. How do you think she was feeling in that moment? We're gonna put aside the troubling pieces of her behavior and focus on this part. Betrayed, yep. Yeah, if it hasn't happened yet, it won't happen now. Yeah, absolutely. She did forget who she was messing with. I would argue she forgot who she was messing with 13 years ago when she suggested that he take a second wife. What do you think, Sandra? God does have jokes. God does have jokes. Yep. All right, so we're in chapter 20 or chapter 18. And this is where after the covenant, after the circumcision, after the renaming, it says, the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent at the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, my Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. Do as they said, do as you have said. And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour and knead it and make cakes. Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and it had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. We should bring back that phrase. I think it's delightful. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." So with these angels showing up, we get this official announcement. You've been patient for 24 years. It has ceased to be with your wife as in the manner of women. But now, she'll bear a son. It is interesting when we look at this text because it gives credit to Abraham for doing all this stuff, but it's really Sarah and the servant who prepares the cakes and the goat or the calf. Yeah, right? So it goes and has them do this. And then he brought them all the things that he made. All right, well, let's give credit where credit's due. And it must have taken a minute, because you don't just take a calf from the field and then all of a sudden have dinner. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Depending on. Yeah. Yeah, it takes all day to cook an animal like that. Unless, of course, they were having tartare, which, that's not something I would prefer. I'll take a steak medium rare, but that's as far as I go. Yes, Sandra.
I think for me thinking medically on both ends, Abraham and Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham wasn't, medically
So,
was not able to produce
yes.
a child. Then Sarah, she was past too old. So I mean, that kind of blow your mind. I'm 70 some years old, and you tell me now I'm gonna have a baby. Okay, on both ends.
Yeah. Would you have laughed if you were at the entrance of the tent?
Roll around.
You would be rolling on the floor, Rosa.
You say God got jokes. But then we have to remember, and to some degree they were relating to God as if he is God,
Mm-hmm.
and what God says. That's what happens.
I understand that,
Yeah,
but
I mean,
I'm just saying, when you think logically, women go here, men
Yeah.
cannot, reproduce at a certain age. So,
Well, at least they survive.
It,
so they had to do that.
it's, it's fun how our modern minds think about these stories. Because we have the science. We know about fertility a lot more. We have the medication to prolong at least the male ability to procreate. I don't know if we've got, I think what's the record for women having born a child is like late 50s? Yeah. But we have the medical understanding of that now, and it's really interesting how we put that within, and this is like why we do Bible study. This is what it allows us to do. There's what is in the text, what is, like what's between the lines there, and what lens do we bring to it. And so that's why I love having these conversations. It's a lot of fun. Okay, we're going to jump over Sodom and Gomorrah because that's totally off topic. And go right to, we're going to jump over chapter 22 because it's the same situation that happens in Egypt. They go to another place. He passes Sarah off as his sister again. The same thing happens to King Abimelech. And Abimelech is like, get out of here. And eventually they will make amends, Abraham. So let's jump to Genesis chapter 21. God has appeared as these three angels at the oaks of Mamre, said, you will have a child. Sarah thinks it's funny. But we are told in chapter 21, the Lord dealt with Sarah as he has said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, which means Sarah was 90. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So Isaac means the one who laughs. But already here, I'm going to do this to keep this here. We have this little fracture here. And whoever wrote chapter 21, or whoever put it all together, did some weird things. And so we have to parse a couple of these pieces out. Because after Isaac is born and he is weaned, Abraham makes him a great feast to celebrate that he's weaned. He's now a little independent toddler child. But Sarah is still having issues with Hagar. Sarah saw the son Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. So this is firstborn. According to inheritance rules, Ishmael is to get a double portion of the inheritance. And then Isaac gets the rest. So basically, when you're dealing with two kids, he gets 2/3, whereas Isaac gets 1/3 of all that Abraham has. All the land, all the livestock, all the financial.
Everything.
Yeah, everything.
All means all.
All means all, exactly. And it was super important in this time because inheritance was all about the land, keeping the land in the family. And so that is why later on we will have provisions in the Bible around marrying outside of your tribe, because they wanted to keep the land and the property within the territory of the tribe. And so this is particularly distressing. So we've got a couple things going on here. So the first issue for Sarah and Hagar is around fertility. Sarah was barren, Hagar was not. The second issue we have here is the birth order of the sons. If Ishmael had been a girl, this would have not been an issue. No, we didn't count. Isn't that nice? Right. You depend. Yeah, we were worth what our husband could pay for us.
But other than that, my understanding,
Yeah.
that women and children have no value.
Yep. We had no status. And so if you didn't have a man to care for you, that was it. That's why widows were so vulnerable. So we have these two issues going on. I'm also going to put in here sisterhood, because I think this is an important piece. It should have been there, but it was not. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could have worked better if there was not already a pre-existing relationship between Sarah and Hagar where there was already that power dynamic, right? So in chapter 21, verse 11, it says, "The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son Ishmael, who is now about 15." Yeah. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. And as for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring," which is exactly what the Lord had promised to Hagar. I will make a nation of your son. So now a wild nation. So we have here, God had made a promise to Hagar already. I will make a nation of your son. And now God is communicating that promise to Abraham. Don't worry about your son. I'll take care of him. Everything's going to be okay. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder. And this is where it gets confusing. Put it on her shoulder along with the child and sent her away. I know. Right, exactly. Let's finish. I'm going to read the rest of this, and then we're going to talk about why this is why it's such a confusing piece. Sent her away, and she departed and wandered about the wilderness in Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite of him a good way, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite of him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. So if this portion of the story I just read was actually placed in order, it should have come much earlier. Because as you said, he was 15 at this point. He would have been considered an adult. And so he would have been preparing his own household. And so this is where the issue of authorship in the Genesis comes into play, because there are multiple different authors, and then when they put it all together into one narrative, something's got out of order. And this is one of those places where we're out of order, because the way that the writer in this piece is talking about Ishmael, it's as if he too is an infant or a toddler. Mm-hmm. Right, right. Right. Yeah, yep, they would have been, yep. So it would have been, yes, they would have been, absolutely, they're brothers. Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm wondering if it's, Ishmael and Isaac, they're kids. Isaac especially is not going to know any better because he's just a toddler. And being the older brother, he may have he was a wild ass of a man, so we really don't know. But he was still his older brother, still part of the household for now. And so as far as this goes, this seems to be more of an issue between Hagar, but of Sarah's making than anything else. Kind of making a mountain out of a molehill because she's afraid that Ishmael, according to the inheritance laws of that time and the practices, was going to have a higher status than her son. That could have been too.
I'm thinking now, okay, even nowadays, there's times when there's sibs who are 10, 11, and 12 years apart.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes the older sib does become very attached to the younger sib.
Yeah.
So often we say now, especially back in the day, we used to say that when I was a teenager and mom had a baby, mom was covering for the teenager. So it's not, I don't think it's uncommon for older sib,
Mm-hmm.
because here is a war between Hagar and Sarah. Not really.
No, unless.
No, he's not, a participant.
Right.
He just happened to be, an object of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yes. My youngest cousin who's getting married this fall is 13 years younger than my older cousin. So, but yeah, these two boys, unless the moms have been talking smack behind each other's backs to their kids directly, these two are uninvolved. This war, it's a good term, this feud is between these two women. So this is why this story gets complicated. But God makes good for both of these kids. We will learn, let's see, the end of this piece is that God was with Ishmael. He grew up and lived in the wilderness, became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got him a wife from the land of Egypt. So God took care of him. It wasn't probably the life that Hagar expected, but God took care of him. And his wife and Hagar probably went to her family to find a cousin or a friend to find a wife for Ishmael. Yeah. So this is, unfortunately, we don't hear about the death of Hagar. We have rabbis, and one, this is a book that have been using in putting this Bible study together. Wilda Gaffney, she is a professor of the Hebrew Bible in Texas, and she has written this book, Womanist Midrash, and she writes a midrash. The midrash were the teachings and the conversations that the rabbis had, and she writes a midrash talking about the death of Hagar, because she was just like, they don't talk about her. She just disappears. And for someone who plays such an important role in the faith traditions that we have today, as the bearer of Ishmael, the firstborn son of Abraham, I will find it and we'll read it together because it's nice. Let me see it here. I don't think it's right that her death isn't talked about. So in here, this is what Dr. Gaffney writes. And Hagar lived 77 years. This was the length of Hagar's life. Hagar breathed her last and died in a good old age, an old woman and full of years, and was gathered to her people. Hagar died at Heliopolis in the land of Egypt, and Ishmael, her son, went in to mourn for Hagar and to weep for her. And Hagar's daughters and sons from the man she chose for herself mourned with Ishmael and his daughter Mahalat. After this, Ishmael had his mother embalmed and mummified and placed Hagar, his mother, in a sarcophagus in a tomb in Heliopolis in the land of the Nile. The tomb and the land that is around it passed through the generations of the Hagrites as a burying place. There Hagar was buried with her man. So Dr. Gaffney gives her a death story, which I think is really nice.
And at some point in time, you would say with her man?
With her man, that she chose.
She chose, right.
Yes.
More or less, with her husband, more or less?
Yeah, so that would have been her second husband. Yeah. So according to the way that Dr. Gaffney tells the end of Hagar's story, Hagar gets autonomy back. And she goes back to her people in Egypt where she came from. Because according to this story, they probably bought her as a slave while they were in Egypt the first time, Abraham and Sarah, because she comes from Egypt. So Dr. Gaffney returns her to her people, gives her choice of her second husband, and then she's buried among her people. And so I think that's a really beautiful way to tell the end of her story. Sarah, however, we hear about. After the near sacrifice of Isaac, which is told about in chapter 22, we are told in chapter 23 that Sarah lived 127 years. This was the length of Sarah's life. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Abraham rose up from beside his dead, and said to the Hittites, I am a stranger and an alien residing among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, so that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you any burial ground for burying your dead." Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. He said to them, "If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and entreat for me Ephron, son of Zohar, so that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as a possession for a burying place." And so that becomes, and that cave is still honored as the site of the burial place of Abraham and Sarah in Hebron, in the Holy Land. And so we see these death stories of the one that is contained here in Genesis and the one that Dr. Gaffney wrote for Hagar, which she modeled after the death story of Sarah. We can hear very close similarities. She dies at 127 and is buried in the choicest place that the Hittites sell to Abraham. And the really cool thing that we will see is that when Abraham dies, the brothers will come together and bury him together. And so the feud doesn't last beyond the women. And what we see from a historical perspective is Isaac will become the ancestor of the Jewish peoples and then the Christian peoples. Ishmael becomes the ancestor of the Muslim tradition. And so when we refer to the Abrahamic tradition, we refer to Jewish people, Christians, and Muslims all together. From these two women. So just a couple quick closing themes, and then we'll close. While Sarah doesn't always trust God, God is faithful. And God makes good on God's promise to Sarah and to Abraham. God is faithful and sees Hagar when no one else does and hears her. And that God, as we see happen throughout the scripture, is able to take something that is a terrible situation and redeem it. So God takes the horrible situation that Hagar is in under the terrible treatment of Sarai and redeems it through the birth of Ishmael, who will become the ancestor of the Muslim tradition, and indeed many nations. So let us close with prayer. God, we thank you for the stories of Sarah and Hagar, who, though complicated and fraught, and though these two women were at war with each other, you showed your faithfulness to both of them, making good on your promise to Sarah, hearing and seeing Hagar, being faithful to both of these women, making both of them the matriarch of many nations. We thank you for the ways that in our lives you are able to redeem terrible situations. We thank you that we see that most powerfully through the crucifixion and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. Be with us in the rest of this day and bring us back together safely next week as we study more women of the Bible. Amen. Thank you all so much for coming. Thanks for joining us on YouTube, and we'll be back next week. We're going to talk about the wives of Jacob. You're welcome.